Welcome to Session 4. This session addresses a wide range of specific information, requirements, and policies concerning our clinical teaching semester at A&M. We will go back and forth between the handbook and miscellaneous handouts, so have all of your hard copies assembled and in the correct order. For this first slide, you will need Handbook page 7, which is entitled Clinical Teaching Policies. The second item on this page is about attendance, which is an extremely important topic for clinical teachers. At the orientation seminar, discuss the importance of attendance. Acknowledge that there are illnesses that prevent clinical teachers from attending school. For example, it is understood that fever or stomach disorder would require them to stay home. They should go to the doctor if they feel it is appropriate. However, if they're tired or just in general do not feel well, they should go to school. Stress that leaving the school campus during the school day is not permitted without prior approval. Make it clear that in the case of an absence, there are 3 notifications to make: the cooperating teacher, you, the supervisor, and the school office. Do this as soon as possible. All absences must be officially reported by each clinical teacher through the online student data portal, and all absences must be made up. The makeup requirements are listed on this page. Basically, an excused absence is 1 makeup for 1 absence, 1 for 1. An unexcused absence is 2 makeup days per absence. 3 unexcused days of absence equals an unsatisfactory grade in clinical teaching. Absences to substitute teach or to take certification exams are unexcused. 1 excused absence is allowed for a professional interview. This is a good time to also stress the importance of being on time each day, which means being in the classroom at least 10 to 15 minutes before students arrive in the classroom. Also stress the importance of following the school's guidelines for teachers leaving school at the end of the day. On the next slide, you see the remainder of the page on clinical teaching policies. On your hard copy, look at the last section entitled Work, Courses, and Grading. Working during clinical teaching must be limited to 10 to 12 hours per week and preferably be on weekends. Weekday afternoons should be free for seminars, faculty meetings, and curriculum planning. At the end of the semester, clinical teachers are assigned S for satisfactory and U for unsatisfactory. Advancing to the next slide, you see clinical teaching assignments. This is page 8 from the handbook. The first item in the list refers to the acknowledgement page that is in the handbook on page 4. At the orientation seminar, clinical teachers are to sign and give this page to you, acknowledging that they have read the clinical teaching handbook, the information on the need for liability insurance, etc. Keep these pages until the semester is ended, at which time you may dispose of them. Also, at the orientation seminar, tell clinical teachers that they are to upload a copy of this page into the CEHD data portal if they've not already done so. The third item in the list refers to the clinical teaching emergency contact form that is on page 28 in the handbook. Clinical teachers are to complete this, make 3 copies, and submit 1 to you, 1 to their cooperating teacher, and 1 to the front office. Also, they are to upload the completed form in the CEHD data portal. Find the 6th bulleted item in the list. It says organize a clinical teaching notebook using a large 3-ring binder with individual dividers. At your orientation seminar, make it clear to your clinical teachers that they are to organize this notebook according to these guidelines and keep it on their desk or a designated space in their classrooms, and let them know that you will need to access it each time that you observe. Tell them that you will spot check the lesson plans filed in this notebook and initial the attendance log on each visit. The most recent lesson plans should be kept in the front of the section for lesson plans. Point out the list of sections that are to be included in the notebook. The next slide is a continuation of the topics on the hard copy page that you have on clinical teaching assignments. As you can see, the next section is entitled Journal. At the orientation seminar, discuss the importance of journaling as explained in this bullet. This is what my clinical teachers do. Their journaling begins with week 2. They generate 1 journal entry for each day. The journal entry can be about a specific lesson, a particular student, no name included, the day in general, a classroom management goal or issue, a successful or humorous event from that day, a problem or a concern. The list just goes on and on. Once the first full responsibility begins, they have a new option. The daily journal entry can be replaced with a weekly list of short-term goals. This weekly list of short-term goals must be recorded in the journaling spiral or clinical teaching notebook at the beginning of each week. If this option is chosen, one journal entry must be written at the end of the week reflecting on that week's goals. In summary, this option consists of one list of short-term goals and one journal entry per week. Many clinical teachers find this option quite helpful. I do read each journal entry and initial it so my clinical teachers know that I've read it. Journaling forces the clinical teacher to think about what is happening in the classroom, and reading these journal entries helps me get to know each clinical teacher in an individual manner, and I do learn a lot by reading their journal entries. The next major topic on this page is entitled eCampus. All of our clinical teachers are required to go online during this semester and respond to several discussion questions and read discussion entries from other clinical teachers. This is their eCampus online assignment for the semester. You do not have any responsibilities with this requirement other than reminding your clinical teachers to do it. Clinical teachers will receive information about eCampus as well as other official clinical teaching updates through their TAMU accounts. So remind your clinical teachers to check their A&M, TAMU accounts regularly for information from the Office of Field Experiences. If one of your clinical teachers does not meet a deadline for an eCampus assignment, you will receive an email asking you to contact that clinical teacher and remind him or her to complete the assignment that is missing. The next slide is the formal observation. This form is on page 16 in the handbook. Our formal observation form has been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System referred to as T-TESS. You will use this form for critiquing your formal observations. You already know that you will formally observe each clinical teacher a total of 4 times during the semester, 2 times prior to the midpoint conference and at least 2 times between the midpoint conference and the final conference. Additional observations may be needed if a clinical teacher is experiencing difficulties. You also know that a pre-conference is conducted prior to each formal observation and that each observation is at least 45 minutes in length. Now let's take a look at the heading on the form. For each of your formal observations, you will need to record the date for the pre-conference, the date, time in, and time out for the observation, as well as the beginning and ending time of the follow-up conference. Also take note of the rating scale for each descriptor, as well as the overall rating number for each lesson observed. Prior to each observation, it is suggested that you print hard copies of this form. While observing, you will record your feedback on this form. By using carbon paper, you will have a copy to leave with the clinical teacher. And yes, I know this is really high-tech, but it is quick and it does work. Using your written feedback from each formal observation, you will conduct a follow-up conference with the clinical teacher. The conference might be face-to-face immediately following the lesson or by phone or at a later time that's more convenient for each of you. If it is a face-to-face conference, give the clinical teacher a hard copy of the completed observation form at the end of the conference. If the follow-up conference will be later by phone, then leave a hard copy of the completed observation form on the clinical teacher's desk before you leave. Focus on self-evaluation during each follow-up conference. Have the clinical teacher reflect on what went well and what did not, and use that feedback from the clinical teacher as a springboard to guide this follow-up conference. Remember to note the beginning time and ending time for each follow-up conference because you will need this information later when you fill out the online form. After the follow-up conference, you will use the link provided to you by the Office of Field Experiences to enter your data from the observation to the online formal observation form, and this needs to be done within 48 hours of the observation. Once you click Submit, your typed data will automatically be emailed to the clinical teacher. It's now the clinical teacher's responsibility to type and submit reflections about this lesson, and you can see the reflection questions at the bottom of the observation form. The clinical teacher is to complete each reflection within 48 hours of receiving the automated typed document. Once the clinical teacher hits Submit, an electronic copy of the information you entered online, including the clinical teacher's reflections, will automatically be sent to the cooperating teacher, the building principal, A&M, etc. No action is required by the recipients of this final electronic copy. It is simply an attempt by TEA to keep everyone informed of how the clinical teacher is progressing. And just so you know, you and the clinical teacher will also receive an electronic copy of this final document. The next slide is the midpoint final evaluation form, and this form is on page 17 in the handbook. This midpoint final evaluation will be used to document each clinical teacher's progress and will guide the midpoint conference, which is conducted during week 6 or 7. This same form will be used again at the final conference during weeks 13 or 14. This form has also been adapted to reflect portions of the t-test. And notice the rating scale that will be used for each descriptor, and also take note of the 4 domains: planning, instruction, learning environment, and professional practices and responsibilities. You will give prior notification through an email to the cooperating teacher noting a day and time for the 3-way midpoint conference, and do the same in the semester for the final conference. You and the cooperating teacher will each fill out this form separately and bring the completed forms to the midpoint conference and again to the final conference at the end of the semester. At the midpoint and again at the final conference, you will meet with the cooperating teacher. First, for approximately 10 minutes to compare numbers on your completed evaluation forms. The numbers may or may not be the same. As long as the numbers are consecutive, all is well. In other words, a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4 would be fine. But if the numbers are a 2 and a 4, then you need to discuss the reason for the wide gap and make the needed changes. And following this brief meeting with the cooperating teacher, have the clinical teacher join you and the cooperating teacher conduct a 15 to 20 minute 3-way conference. As noted earlier, this midpoint final evaluation provides structure for the conferences. At the midpoint, the 3-way conference is focused on the clinical teacher's strengths and areas for growth or refinement as indicated on the evaluation form. At the final conference, keep the focus on the areas where the clinical teacher has grown, as indicated by the numbers on the evaluation form, and mention the areas that will continue to improve with experience. It's also a good time to address interviewing tips. Give the cooperating teacher ample opportunity for input during both the midpoint and final conferences. At the midpoint conference and again at the final conference, the clinical teacher will receive a hard copy of this evaluation form from you and one from the cooperating teacher. Once the midpoint conference is completed, and again later when the final conference is complete, you and the cooperating teacher each go online using the links provided by the Office of Field Experiences and enter the numbers you each have on your form. To repeat, the university supervisor, that's you, and the cooperating teacher separately enter their numbers online after the midpoint conference and after the final conference. After the final conference, the university supervisor and cooperating teachers do one more thing. A recommendation for standard certification must be submitted in the CEHD data portal. The next slide is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint and Final Conferences. The basics of what you need to remember about observations, including TEA requirements, and midpoint and final conferences are all summarized on this one page. For this reason, I refer to it as the go-to page on documentation requirements for observations and or midpoint final conferences. With a few exceptions, everything on this page has already been mentioned during this audio session, so we'll go on to the next slide at this time. For this slide, you will need a copy of page 26 from the handbook. It is entitled Growth Probation Plan. If a clinical teacher is experiencing significant problems, the university supervisor will observe this clinical teacher more often than the minimum number of observations. If these significant problems occur over and over with no improvement noted, it may be time for a growth plan. If a problem is caught early enough, a growth plan will generally solve the issue or problem. Your access to the online growth plan is through a link which is on the very same page where you gain access to the online formal observation form. Record your documentation for the growth plan on this online form. Before submitting it online, though, you will need to notify Kim Parrish. Be specific with the problematic areas, suggest intervention strategies, a timeline, and any other pertinent information. For the rare occasions when a growth plan does not successfully solve the issue, confer with Kim again and in the Office of Field Experiences to receive guidance before proceeding with a probation plan. And just so you know, situations requiring a probation plan are rare. The next slide is page 27 from the handbook. It is the clinical teacher's attendance log. Take note, though, an online version of this log will be piloted in the near future, but for now, you'll need to explain this page in detail to your clinical teachers. Note the column labeled a number day. Clinical teachers will enter a 1 by their start date and continue with numbers 2 through 70 for each full day in their assigned classroom. Clinical teachers will enter their arrival and departure times for each day of clinical teaching. Holidays will need to be labeled appropriately with no numbered day or times. Staff development days do count toward the 70 days, so we'll need all data recorded. It is the clinical teacher's responsibility to keep the log up to date and ask his or her cooperating teacher to initial the data each day. The cooperating teacher's initial will indicate that the data entered is correct. You will monitor this requirement by spot checking and initialing the log on the date of each of your 4 observations. Be sure to sign attendance logs during the final conferences, and remind clinical teachers that they must upload a signed copy into the CEHD data portal at the end of the semester, in fact, on their very last day. The next slide is the emergency contact form. This is a required form. If an emergency occurs during the clinical teacher's field experience, this form would be vitally important. After filling out the required information, they make 3 copies to distribute, 1 to you, 1 to the cooperating teacher, and 1 to the front office. They are to distribute this form on or by the first day of clinical teaching. Also remind them to upload this completed form into the CEHD data portal for use by the Field Experiences Office. For the next slide and the following 3 slides, you will need your copy of the miscellaneous handout entitled Supervisor's Weekly Plan of Action. And this handout is 4 pages in length. And this is just a week-by-week guide as to what a Texas A&M University supervisor does during the semester. Use it as a reference. Since I am a university supervisor, I've included items in this document that reflect what I personally do in addition to what is required. Adjust as you go so as to fit your style of supervision. Just make sure that you are fulfilling all the basic requirements. Since this document is quite detailed and an easy read, we'll not spend time discussing every single detail. We will, however, quickly skim through each main heading so that you will have an idea of the type of information that is included here. So, the Supervisor's Weekly Plan of Action. Week 1 includes miscellaneous information about the orientation seminar for clinical teachers. And along with the suggestions of what to discuss or emphasize during this seminar, remember you're setting the tone for the semester. Be specific with your expectations, the deadlines, the requirements, responsibilities, etc. And some of these have been listed below. Note the bullet that explains the high visit as optional but highly recommended and why. There's information about the second seminar, which is mandatory. Note that the weekly updates are optional, but it is wise to send them. It is equally wise to send updates and reminders to your cooperating teachers on an as-needed basis. There's information about weekly schedules, such as when they're due and options on how they are to be submitted to you. Moving on to the next slide. Now looking at weeks 2 through 4, there's a suggestion concerning when to begin observing, which is to wait until week 3. There is information about what to observe for the first formal observation and the observation form to use, which is the formal observation form. There's also information about the length of each observation, which is at least 45 minutes. Also, what to do before and after each observation. You already know to conduct a pre-observation conference. The method is your choice, in person, by phone, or electronically. A follow-up conference is also required for each observation. The follow-up conferences can be face-to-face or by phone. Not electronically, though, like the pre-conference. And self-evaluation is emphasized, and also provide the clinical teacher with a copy of your written documentation. There's information about the online requirement. You are to transfer your handwritten feedback to the online version of the formal observation form, and details about this are listed in this bullet. There is a bullet about the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Remind your cooperating teachers that clinical teachers need regular written feedback. Emphasize that each clinical teacher should receive some type of written feedback at least once a week from his or her cooperating teacher. By the end of week 4, each clinical teacher should have one complete formal observation by you, his or her university supervisor. The last bullet addresses the growth probation plan, which we've already discussed. Moving on to the next slide, weeks 5 and 6. The second formal observation is discussed. The last bullet is about thinking ahead to week 7, which is generally the midpoint conference week. Now, week 7, there is a reminder about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the midpoint conference and a discussion about preparing for the midpoint conference. The format for the midpoint conference is discussed in a bullet, and this is a good review of details that were discussed earlier in this audio session. The online requirement for you and the cooperating teacher is also discussed. It may be necessary to remind the cooperating teacher to complete this requirement within 48 hours of the conference. Now for the last slide in this audio session, weeks 8 through 10, there's information here about the third observation form. Also, there's information about second environment, which is optional. And second environment is simply observing in other classrooms for no more than 5 days. Weeks 11 through 13, there's information here about the fourth formal observation. Also, there is a reminder about thinking ahead to week 14, as well as information about a wrap-up seminar, which is optional. Week 14 may extend into week 15 in order to total 70 days plus the career fair day. There is information here about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the final conferences and also the guidelines for the final conference. Remember that after the final conference, the university supervisor and cooperating teacher will each submit an electronic copy of the final evaluation in the CEHD data portal within 48 hours of the final conference. Also, using that same portal, the university supervisor and cooperating teacher will each submit a recommendation for standard certification. Remember that this document is it's an excellent week-by-week reference or resource for you on the basic requirements. I hope that each of you will take time to read through this entire document and refer to it during this semester as needed. You are welcome to email me with questions. My contact information is at the end of the document. This concludes Session 4.